the advertisements, if they're only promoting things that are fueling self-medication, increasing high risk factors, that's problematic. You start to look at all the things in the environment, the physical built environment, just as much as your home environment. Do you have the proper, fridge and stove that isn't like always breaking down to prepare the homemade meals? Do you have the food in the fridge? Do you know even how to cook? We have homemade economics out. And so how are people learning skills? Typically online, YouTubes and food networks of the world. And so you end up realizing like it is a social ecological model in which you can begin looking at a number of factors.
Hey friends, welcome to Public Health Careers. I'm Omari Richens, founder of the Public Health Millennial and host of Public Health Careers. Join us as we dive deep into public health topics and career journeys. You'll hear diverse career stories, absorb professional development and career strategies to help you learn, navigate, and transform your public health journey. On today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Tambra Raye Stevenson, a true trailblazer in public health and food equity. Tambra is the founder and CEO of WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. She's also a PhD candidate at the American University School of Communication, a TEDx speaker, and an advocate for empowering women in agriculture and nutrition globally. Tambra's work has been featured in Forbes and National Geographic. Her career spans public health, media, and food systems, making her a leader at the intersection of communication, health, and advocacy. She conferred a Bachelor's of Science in Human Nutrition and a minor in Spanish from Oklahoma State University, and continued on to get a Master's of Public Health and Health Communication at Tufts University School of Medicine, as well as a Master of Arts in Media Technology and Democracy at the American University. Today, we'll discuss Tambra's journey from nutrition science to public health advocacy, the founding and mission of WANDA and its initiatives and impact, the intersection of communication and public health, lessons for an aspiring public health professional, the role that culture has on food and health, and much, much more. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and enjoy today's episode.
Hi, this is Tambra Raye Stevenson, and I'm the founder of WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, and you're listening to Public Health Careers.
Welcome to the show, Tambra. I'm super excited to have you on today.
The pleasure's mine.
Truly is my pleasure. So jumping into things, tell us a little bit about your personal identity and a little bit about your personal background.
My background, I'm born and raised in Oklahoma and also in Texas. I really was someone who was just super curious as a kid and found myself lover of arts, but also smart enough to do STEM and chose a path in nutrition and public health and now communication. And so the best way to think about me is the systems thinking mindset. I think very interdisciplinary, which public health just put more gas to the fire, and appreciating the different disciplines coming together to solve the world's public health challenges. And in this case, for me, that's our food system and how that impacts our overall health and our longevity.
And as a Black female leader in public health, how has your identity informed your advocacy for health equity and what cultural inclusion in food systems looks like?
So I definitely have valued over time the many different intersectional identities that I possess, meaning not just in terms of my ethnic background, but also gender and geography, and also just how I was raised and how important those personal components really can help create the value systems and how you really propel within your career. And that was definitely in my case. And so for me, not only just being African American, but also like learning the Africa in my America was equally as important of having appreciate my African ancestry and those who had to overcome great adversity, and to know that that is within my own DNA of my ability to navigate harsh terrain and climates, and what may be perceived as a setback can be a setup for success, but it really is a mindset shift, because all of us in this human journey experience will overcome hopefully, the adversity that is in front of us to test how strong our conviction is. And so, to me, faith is part of my identity as much, because in order to persevere and overcome any conflicts and trials and challenges that come in front of you, behind you, the side of you, all of that makes a huge difference in how iron sharpens iron, how diamonds are formed under pressure. Or my kid would say, no, it takes carbon. But I will say it takes all of that, and it takes the village also. So the collective identity and what I've formed through my relationships, through sorority life, through WANDA also is equally as a part of forming and really forecasting my journey as well.
What I'm really hearing is just like the reflection in the work that you've done and where you've come from is kind of like comes out in the work that you do and how you show up in that work and the values you bring to that work. I think it's very important that we know our identities and the intersections of those identities and are able to come into this type of work and working with communities with that perspective, which is so important.
Most definitely, it is. I think the key part I've come to realize is getting a PhD in me was the foundational before ever working on a PhD path, and partly because you learn so much in the process of who you are, or as in Oprah Winfrey says, whose you are. Because when you do that, if you master yourself, you can never be a slave to anyone else. And I find that to be incredibly important because while we believe that slavery is over and abolished, the reality is life sometimes can feel like a performative plantation, and you deciding on which role will you play in the midst of this show. But to know that your identity, whether that's taking on the avatar of a Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, it's so critical to know which footsteps that you're walking in order to guide your path. Just as people identify with, Jesus Christ and their path, it's important to know that we're never alone in this journey of life. But it's your ability to identify who your tribe will be and how do you have a vibe that attracts the right one in order to move in the direction you want to go.
And shifting a little bit here, what does public health mean to you?
Public health for me is the forest. It's people who represents the trees that represent the different disciplines from epidemiology, biostatistics to policy to the educator, management, all play critical roles in the system of building a strong public health system. And we saw that with this pandemic of our lifetime, with COVID-19, of really showing how and why public health matters. I hope much can be taken away of the need to build strong, resilient systems at all levels, hyperlocal to state and national. That public health represents the soft savings of healthcare. You may not always see the effects of it, because if we've done our job right, it would have been prevented. But the goal is to reduce the cost, reduce the impact on life, and improve quality of life for a population level, because it is the way in which we build a strong national security system. I think when you consider military, right now they're seeing the effects of childhood obesity as those young people become adults and not being able to be fit to fight for our freedom, and the need to have a second component of a boot camp just to prepare them to become a healthy, viable soldier that can be deployed in defense of national security. So as someone who's been a born national security scholar and at one point a nominee for West Point, I'm super mindful of what it takes to build national security is very much in lock with public health security as well. And that means also nutrition security.
And how does nutrition security tie into that?
Well, partly when you let's just start with a kid in the classroom. If you have a hungry belly, it's hard to concentrate on the education that the instructor gives you. Not only that, you have, a cognitive decline. Also, when we think about the person who shows up at the workforce, they have a need to be high performing. And so, again, if their ability to not take in proper nutrition for their brain health as well as their physical health, in terms of their gut, if they're always, um, you know, having those signs and symptoms just like a car, when lights come on and no one's home, like that's a time where you end up having absenteeism, having to always be at the doctor's office. You can't really focus and do the job at hand. And then you just have the overall effects as a population when you times that, of what is the economic impact on society, of just reducing health cost burden, and acknowledging the quality of life factor. So while we may be living longer, because of lifestyle factors such as our ability to manage stress, which we self-medicate with the food choices that we make, that we may not have the convenient foods that are in the forms of fruits and vegetables that people should be able to afford. That all ties into how are we managing. So if we're self-medicating with foods that what I call that will not sustain life, but just get us from point A to B and versus Z, that's not doable over time. Pocket wise, in terms of dollars, it doesn't make sense. And healthcare wise, it doesn't make sense at all. If we are always looking for a silver bullet in the form of a pill, it may give us immediate remedy, but over time, the goal is a lifestyle transformation. And that takes effort, willpower. That is why we have the power of free will, to make decisions. And it's up to us to decide what do we choose to value. Uh, and sometimes it's between health and wealth decisions, but in the end, if you have no health, it doesn't matter how much wealth you have.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I think that that's a really great perspective. And going back to like what you were saying just a little bit earlier, how the tie between public health and national security is it's like imminent if you like look at it and see those different as, and I guess the nutrition as well. But maybe that is the perspective that we have to try to talk about the importance of public health and prevention and all of this work, because even though we've had a pandemic, even though public health has been doing a good job, there's still so much backlash and so much pushback against public health. So I think that calms piece and how we talk about it is so important as well.
Yeah, it's kind of bananas to think about. How do you not see the need to invest? But that's why when we understand systems thinking, it goes back to values, and the iceberg picture is what comes to mind. Is that everyone sees the peak of the iceberg, but it's what is under the currents that determine how that iceberg, is floating within the waters, and that means your foundation and what we value. If we value health as a population, as a society, all health, not just some, then we will put the right resources and infrastructure in place. And I look at the world through a food lens. And so, in the community of Anacostia in Washington, D.C., where I call home, so we have, not enough grocery stores. That's one indicator. Community gardens, another indicator. The advertisements, if they're only promoting things that are fueling self medication, increasing high risk factors, that's problematic. You start to look at all the things in the environment, the physical built environment, just as much as your home environment. Do you have the proper, fridge and stove, that isn't like always breaking down to prepare the homemade meals? Do you have the food in the fridge? Do you know even how to cook? We have home economics out. And so how are people learning skills? Typically online, YouTubes and food networks of the world. And so end up realizing like it is a social ecological model in which you can begin looking at a number of factors. Self-determination theory also comes to mind, that you can have all the resources, but if you have no sense of agency of self to actually take advantage of the resources and be your best advocate, that also is another factor. So as someone, trained in health communication from the school that created the field, Tufts University, I think about how important um, the field has evolved over time, but there's so many other factors with social media now being a huge gateway that has opened up the floodgates of misinformation, disinformation, as well as accurate health information, because we no longer have the gatekeepers and we have the influencers. So there's a lot that can be unpacked. I think there's an opportunity, not only on the side of research but practice, but also just informing everyday consumers around how do they make the most uh, uh, discerning the resources and information in front of them, and being able to train people around health literacy, food literacy, to make the best decisions with the information that they have, since not everyone's going to school to study this. And so you have to find other ways to educate our consumers.
Shifting to your academic pathway, you shared that I believe you said it like you had a love for arts, but you were smart enough to do STEM work.
Mm.
You continued on to earn a bachelor's of science in human nutrition, pre-medical sciences with a minor in Spanish from Oklahoma State University. So tell us about that thought process going into undergrad, and then how did your undergrad experience shape your understanding of public health and nutrition?
Yeah, I would definitely say before entering Oklahoma State, I uh, joined a summer pre-matriculation program that was that definitely influenced my decision to switch from University of Tulsa to Oklahoma State. And that was partly based off, again, what the research shows and what my research now is on belonging. That when young people feel, or anyone feels belonged in environments like universities, they improve and succeed academically. And so that seed was first planted there. I was formed friends. I was getting college credit, like knocking out my math and English, studying, understanding the research labs there, what opportunities. And so every summer, since really ninth grade, I've been at some university, medical school, um, doing a STEM summer program, and that all has built like a culminating experience on top of one another. So I went in really with a focus, even before thinking about military schools, to be a bilingual military teaching physician. I switched to just preventative health physician, knowing that I would be interested in lifestyle medicine early on, just by looking at family members and what can be prevented. Since I saw everything from diabetes type 2 to coronary heart disease, breast cancer, lupus, and fibromyalgia, just a range of issues that I thought, not all of this can be genetic. Some of this has to be preventable, but I got to figure out how. And so one summer, right after my freshman year at Texas Children and Baylor Med and Rice, again, just doing more coursework and working with Dr. Steve Abrams in pediatric nutrition research and neonatology, made me realize, like, oh, nutrition is a real science. Yeah, as I later switched to nutrition my sophomore year, our Dean Knob, she would joke around like not having any brooms, as if it was a home economics school, because that was the joke by the math department folks, of what HES at the time stood for, which was Human Environmental Sciences. Now it's just Human Sciences. But I've valued the training there. I think because of the nature of science, sometimes, it's almost like accounting. You can lose the sense of humanity when you just drill people down to zeros and ones. And so being over at that college, it really was about, taking human development, understand the life process in nutrition and aging process, and just appreciating all the different stages of life that we endure, and how does it change? How do our needs change? Our physiological needs, as well as nutritional needs and societal needs. And so that information has carried on with me ever since, while doing bone mineral research and botany research throughout my undergrad career. But I knew if I were to stay in Oklahoma for my education, that I still needed to get exposure to other environments, just to round me up and realize the full possibilities that were available. So I was very intentional, very self-motivated, because I just really believed in myself and believed in the possibilities of like why God put me on this earth to do purpose-driven work. So it was not an advisor. I won't say I just pulled myself up by the bootstraps, but I definitely was the captain of my ship. And I remember even in graduating, I read that poem and a few others that were like driving forces and motivating me. So after that summer of my freshman year, I went, from Baylor, then to UPenn, where I met really my first Black nutrition researcher, Dr. Shariki Kumika, who's at Drexel now, but she was heading up the HELP study, which was focusing on healthy eating lifestyle program, looking at African American and Latino communities. And that was the first time, like, it's one thing to study community nutrition in a class. It's another thing to design interventions in the community and factoring, all the things that um, everything from childcare to transportation, what prevents people from being recruited into studies, as well as doing the transcriptions and asking the right questions. And so that was a good break from being in like bench work lab, working with rat models, to like see this human studies that are being designed. Um, and then, going to Harvard Public Health the next summer, again, still doing human studies, but community focused out of WIC centers, focusing on a Dominican population of mothers in a maternal child health nutrition study. And that really was the spark for me to want to go abroad, because being on the East Coast by then, that was my first time being in Philly, being in Boston, seeing people who, even though I had a Ghanaian stepdad early in life, and knew that there were people not born in America, that was really evident being on the East Coast, just by the nature of, how migration patterns flow. And so meeting people from Haiti, from, DR, it really kind of like put the light bulb of like, wow, I want to study like the etiology of how they think about systems in public health. And so I got the Born National Security Scholarship to fund me to go to study at Pucamaima in Santiago in DR. And that was eye-opening and really planted the seed of the travel bug, because by then I am working not only in the Bate, which is a Haitian migrant community, where we're doing health charlas, just they were like just health talks with the community health workers around, sexual health issues, but also studying the healthcare system, doing tours with the different provinces, private care, public care. What does social medicine look like? Why, when people come to this country, they're like, nah, I don't want to be a part of nobody's public programs, by way of looking at what they've come from. So to me, that was really eye-opening to understand the cultural orientation. We had a course at Tufts, because by then the trip and study abroad to DR was the bridge between undergrad and grad. And when I then started to study at the graduate level and taking, sitting in courses on race, healthcare, and ethnicity, and hearing about cultural orientation, because again, I didn't really realize like how this culture play a role in health. Is one thing to think demographics, like, oh, you're Black, you're Asian, whatever, but what does that really mean from a psychographic perspective when you think about immigration as an identity, as much as the religion layered on education, class status, like all these are additional layers that determine like one's ability to take in information, process it, and actually utilize information. And so I became even more mindful and sensitive to like all these different identities that we now understand as intersectional identities, and how people navigate systems and public health systems included, and how they, take in messaging and how do they actually change their behavior or not. Because if we don't have that appreciation, we go and blame people and patients and consumers of like, why don't they just do X, Y, and Z? And I think that's very insensitive, and does not take in the full humanity of people. And unfortunately, in the making of the field of health comm, as there was a hashtag at a recent health comm conference I went to a few years back, HCOM so white. It was a trend that was acknowledging, how it was founded, how did it actually take in different lived experiences, and how do we begin to look at the scholars in the space diversifying and bringing their own, um, not only ideologies, but really conceptual frameworks that are factoring in these other cultural elements that need to be considered in designing out programs.
I appreciate that. There's a lot of great information there. I think like your journey going from wanting to come into school, be a bilingual doctor, and then figuring out that nutrition is a science, and then realizing that there's all these cultural aspects to food and health, and how do we bridge these gaps. So from your undergrad, you went in to get your Masters of Public Health in Health Communications at Tufts University School of Medicine. Maybe before we get into that, tell us about maybe some undergrad takeaways and then that pathway for you into your MPH program.
For sure. I definitely love making taglines. So the one for me for undergrad, because that really was a degree in research, was research is the backbone of the clinician. And so for me, I valued having the research background because in this, era of evidence-based practice and medicine, um, we have to factor in like the different studies and findings, and how does that play a role in how we guide and provide protocols to patients, but also acknowledging what came from me out of this, honestly, which directed me to the comm space, was while I was at Harvard, one of my team members went to Tufts for nutrition communication and spoke of, its founding. I went to go visit the program, and I started to look at how we were recruiting using gringo images to a Dominican population, and it just didn't make sense. As someone who just, again, I won a 4-year art scholarship. I love art, love photography, all of that. And I would doodle. I was a doodler in anatomical sciences, like sketching human anatomy and all of that. And so for me, it was just like this acknowledgement, like there was this other side of me, like the Africa and the America. Like I'm not one or the other, I'm both. And so I'm not just science, I am art too. And it gives me life to be able to be creative in my expression, but to use my expression as a means to like help society. So for me, health comm was a perfect combination of being able to not throw away all the STEM studies, but at the same time, bring it over to the art of communication, and how do you do that in a way that can improve society. So that's where the goal and of going to Tufts became very clear to me. I want to get as much experience working in the community, living in the community. I lived, basically in the community that I once was doing research in, like Jamaica Plains, Roxbury, and started interning with community health organizations like Boston Black Women's Health Institute, local boutique PR firms that were Black women led, working on healthcare accounts, and then also big firms like a Hill Holiday or Harvard Mag or PBS Boston, just to get all these different experiences of media. And I was very proactive. Again, I never wanted to leave opportunity on a table. So I think I took on the identity of a Jamaican. And so I definitely had 3 internships going on at the same time, paid, unpaid, found ways to get one to pay for the other. I mean, it was definitely a growth opportunity. And then to be in the frigid cold of Boston, I never had cold like that in my life. And I said, never again. So I definitely give props to those who come out of Boston and survive, because going from Oklahoma, where at the time I was living like a queen. I had scholarship. I was on scholarships because I understood the scholarship machine. I made a business out of just applying for scholarships. And so that's what motivated me to keep my academics up, to be in every club that made sense. And then to be very clear in my writing of my goals in these scholarships. And so it paid for everything. And when it came to grad school, I picked tough. Sure, I could say for the education, the reputation, it was #1 in community health by US News. I factored all that in, but at the same time, they gave me money. So, and I applied to 9 undergrad, 9 grad, and, that decision was very clear on, like, okay, what's the best value? Oklahoma State was the best value. Princeton Review even named it. And that's how I look for like good deals, just like shopping. That's how I saw education. And that really just set me up for the opportunity to be in DC, because by working at a little local nonprofit doing the work I valued and appreciated, which was developing Black women health programs that was multi-generational. We had a site visit by the Health and Human Services Regional Director, and he was just like, why don't you apply to the Emerging Leader Program? Like, okay. So I did. I made sure I used his name, and I followed up with him, and out of 2,000 plus people, they picked 80, and I was one of them. And so it was a great opportunity to, like, one, guarantee. I had a job coming out of grad school. And so for me, I think because of the hustle, the grit, the resourcefulness, I think those are other critical takeaways. I never looked for any handout. I looked for an opportunity and made the most of every opportunity. And if I didn't know it, I definitely asked questions. And I say this as someone who just, finished teaching a class, my first college class. I've taught before, but mostly community setting as an extension agent, and there's clear difference between the two. And that's why I really appreciated being an extension agent. But I will say, for the generation now, this desire to be hungry and watch the TED Talk on grit, watch the other TED Talk by Lovia Ajayi-Jones on being comfortable with the uncomfortable, is so important, because in life, everyone will have the similar goals, whether it's to be the doctor, the lawyer, whatever. But how do you choose to be different in the path that you take that makes your path a little bit more unique because you've defined it on your own terms? I think that's so important, to be willing to advocate for yourself, because if you don't, who will? And it's not about being a narcissist. There's a fine line about being boastful and lacking humility, but this conviction, like Jesus, to know that you were destined for greatness, to make a great impact on society, to leave it a little bit better than where it was before you came to this planet, is something that I find incredibly important. So when you think you have no clue about why you're here, find someone to mentor, to pour into you, but also make sure you pour into someone else, because the cycle of life is about being symbiotic. It's not about being extractive that this Western gaze will have you believe. But if you don't pour like a gardener into the soil, how do you expect any nourishment to come forth and bear fruit? So we all have to be like the gardener and see how do we plant the seeds in the next, and we will benefit as a whole because of it.
He later completed a Master of Arts in Media, Technology, and Democracy at the American University. How has this unique combination of health and media influenced your work?
So that was definitely another kind of leap, to switch to another discipline, because even though health comm you would think is the same as any comm, it's not. I came through a med school, so the orientation is different, and I did the program with Emerson and BU in mind, so doing MBA courses as well. So coming to School of Communication, um, after a long stint in industry, mostly public sector, all of it, um, was definitely a leap, because now we have digital media, we have the social media landscape changing everything. It's like the Internet of Things. And so, because of it, it's changing how we take in information. It's how we think about our health, when we think about digital health technologies. And so, I found that it helped me to see what I believe needed to be happening, which is just democratize education, specifically around food, nutrition, and health, and digital technologies, online communities, specifically what I'm researching, can become very vital resources for people who may not see themselves in the public sphere, but need to create these subaltern networks in order to survive. We may call them affinity groups on campuses or in your workplace, but these very niche groups that bring people's identity, be it based off culture or gender or whatever, becomes really important for folks to feel belong in a space that may overall not give them that anchoring. And so being able to study the technology and how that affects our society, and breaking it down to the granular in terms of like how does race, gender, health, and tech intersect, um, was really, not only profound, but it became really important, because so much is happening, from data capitalism, selling off your data, to data surveillance, tracking you through the cookies online, as well as being able to have data privacy issues when it comes to health information. And how does that specifically affect communities that have been historically marginalized, when many times people go onto technology thinking that it's a safe space, but actually it's completely not. It's the physical follows the digital, when we think about inequities. And so for me, it's been great to move from just simply being a consumer of the technology to now being on the side of not only just the scholarship, but being able to like look up underneath the hood, just like a technician, to understand like all the different ways in which um, it can be problematic if you don't have the ethical, moral lens added to um, these human-made technologies.
What do you mean by the physical follows the digital?
Specifically, I'm talking racism. There's a lot of enough studies out there to affirm this um, dynamic, where what we've seen, just kind of like the repatriation happening to Ghana and other places, that we tend to believe that, you know, the physical space we've encountered, um, historically and contemporarily, some kind of oppression of some kind. And so as the internet came on the scene, you started to create these online communities, be it in Facebook or your own platforms. I remember being in undergrad, you had Ski-Fi Chat, but specifically those technologies that were designed by people that don't look like us. And what happens in these communities, if governance is not like incorporated, you think you're safe, but the reality is you're not. And it's because of my own personal experiences in the technology as a consumer that I became, you know, I desired to want to learn more, and why I pursued the PhD. I saw what my kids were on the technology, laptops, and just becoming these digital natives, but not acknowledging like what are the ramifications when we choose to let down our guard, become friends with people online that we don't really know their true identities. But we can become vulnerable. And so there's different ways in which people think about technology. The tech optimists of the world is one, and then you have those who are not so optimistic, but pessimistic about the technology. And so it is rightfully so when you're thinking about humans is behind the technology, we should have that same care and concern and safety and discernment that this is not necessarily we can attempt to create safe environments. However, if there's no proper guidance and moderation, and no protocol and guidelines, just like we have law enforcement and judges um, and lawyers for creating a civil society, the same can be thought about when it comes to digital civil societies and this idea of what are your rights as a digital citizen. Those are conversations and studies that race technology scholars like Ruha Benjamin engage and amplify, and others have gotten into that conversation, but it's really important to factor in when you layer in health issues and the like.
Yeah, thank you for raising that up. And I think back to there's a lot of conversation on like AI and AI models and algorithms and how they are biased because of the same fact that they are created by people who are biased and systems that are biased. And what are the implications there? And I think that that's very, very important and something that we do have to continue to keep a grasp on as these technologies, whether AI or internet or Web 3.0, just becomes more prominent. And how does that show up? And how do we work to decrease those disparities that kind of show up there as well?
That's definitely.
And you kind of alluded to it. So you're a PhD candidate at American University. Your research focuses on communication, media, and public health. Could you share maybe what scares you about this, as well as what excites you most about the work and its real world applications?
So my my interest has been based off my research supervisor or chair, where we focused on community-based communication research. And so that kind of leans into the work at USC, out of the Metamorphosis Lab, of looking at how, just like we in public health look at social ecological models, well, within communication, there's communication ecology, or media ecology, however you want to call it. But acknowledging that as communication and technology has transformed over time, we've created our own media environments that is not just in the physical realm, which we have investigated, like how does media communication flow within communities, and how do communities use that information and operate as a collective to take action, to raise visibility on different issues, be it, food, apartheid, or maybe a transportation issue in the community. And so when you think about it from a digital perspective, we have a digital environment in which we're operating in, where, as a case in point, there have been a number of platforms. Facebook files with the Cambridge Analytica was one scandal that showed how the very games that you may play online, there's the pulling of psychographic information of consumers and selling that data folks who want marketing insights to help develop and shape political campaigns. And so that became a huge issue in 2020 around the elections, and also was a factor in the Brexit that happened as well. And so we had an opportunity to hear from one of those researchers that was part of Cambridge Analytica, that was a whistleblower. That was very insightful, of just acknowledging that when you look at the business models of the platforms, you think, oh, it's free as a consumer, but actually, just like any media, most media are ad-based revenue. And so that ultimately became no differently with the technology. And so having worked in ad firms, um, the critical part is about selling product. And so to sell product is to understand your consumer, to target it and market it better. So it's easy and convenient for them to purchase. And so if you think about with the online sales that happen over Black Friday, you didn't have to leave your home. And so some platforms have gotten really, really good at knowing your triggers to be there and ready so you can plug and play your credit card, me included. And so that ease of convenience in our culture is so important when we think about how does that factor when you think about public health interventions and what are we selling in public health, where it's selling this more ideology sometimes or values like the valuing of like not vaping, and selling you this idea of like, do you pledge to you know lose weight or eat more fruits and vegetables, is what we're trying to sell in terms of healthy lifestyles. And how can the technology, be it creating online health communities, which is what you'll tend to find, how not only academic institutions, but even nonprofits are using the technology to help create their own online interventions at a community level. But there's so many factors in how they design, how they choose to moderate it or not, how they choose to create belonging in those communities and not reinforce the same tropes and stereotypes and biases that can happen offline, that can follow people online. And I think when you don't have that, again, that cultural sensitivity of acknowledging you're lumping all kind of people together, that if we don't have really good moderation, how do we do more harm than we actually heal a situation?
That is very fascinating. And yeah, I definitely advocate for anyone to go check out more about Cambridge Analytica. I think there's a documentary slash show on it on Netflix. And interesting fact, Trinidad and Tobago was one of like the testing grounds for some of that work that was done before it was brought to these bigger countries. And it does beg the question when we think about social media and like, is it free, quote unquote, or are we the product? And what does our data mean for these platforms? And I think there's a lot more that's going to be happening in the conversation around what does maybe digital literacy look like, and how do we stay safe as we navigate and work in the ever evolving world, and where there's so much access to our data. But I think a lot can be said there, and there's a lot yet to be known.
Most definitely. Most definitely. So for those who, are thinking about looking at the humanities side of the technology, communication is evolving in the academic space, with STS studies and um, media technology and democracy studies. But yeah, the pandemic with COVID-19 misinformation and social media policies, which I wrote a paper about, it became clear that the technology companies realized they needed to get public health people on board. And so you started to see Twitter, before it became X, hiring, health researchers, Facebook included, because there was this need, like, if you're going to say that we're going to regulate ourselves, guys, well, that means you need to staff up on people who actually know how the tech is intersecting the health part, because people are making like life in-depth decisions based
Mhm.
off what is happening with these platforms that are not being regulated. And the day in which Facebook had the automation filtering system happening and humans were at home because of the COVID pandemic, showed us what happens when you totally rely on technology. Like humans will always have to be a factor in the technology. And that's so, we have enough case studies to reinforce that. But the ethical moral element is the part that is why the humanities exploration side of the technology become really important. Because if we don't, this is how we have AI running amok and not acknowledging what are the dangers of the technology when we don't put real guards in place, just like civil society.
So you are the CEO and founder of WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. What pivotal moments led you to found WANDA, and how does WANDA work to empower women in nutrition and agriculture?
So for me, Wanda was a need on many different levels. I saw Michelle Obama become like this face of food and nutrition and health in the country that um, I mean, it's been a long time that I can think of a Black woman that had that level of a platform and influence when it comes to the nation's health. And I thought, well, once she leaves, who's going to continue to beating that drum on the need to one, it was a makeover image of how Black women were seen within food and health. Because if you think about the um, the think pieces or the news articles around health and obesity issues, we were definitely not being positioned as the problem solver, but the problem. And that all changed with the imagery and narrative of Michelle Obama, in my opinion. And so for me, the other element was a Time article that said this generation would die before us. And it's just like if we're making these human advancements, how is that even possible? Um, and then we later learned that there's a lot of factors within the system that makes that possible. Um, and so that was another influence about being a mom and what does that mean in terms of like I can only do so much, and how is my current environment and the policy and the media and the resources within the environment playing a factor that work against me or work with me in helping the health of my kids. Um, and then my own journey and experience of just being in nutrition and realizing the lack of diversity, inclusivity in the space, how it shows up in our curriculum, a lot of shame, a lot of just marginalization that happens. And it becomes a mean girl club, whether people realize it or not, and a status quo that happens in a space. And so studying at AU, studying intersectionality helped to give me the language and understanding of like, okay, I'm not going crazy. I knew I wasn't making this up. That's what I acknowledged. That's what I saw. You learn the terms like microaggressions and you learn about, the bias that happens when people, either include you or not. Um, and that feeling of isolation and loneliness that the Surgeon General has now, you know, developed a whole report on that came out last year, same week of my defense, became very clear that yes, we do have an epidemic in this country of loneliness, and we try to solve it in many ways, and not at all. And so for me, Wanda became clear that we needed a sisterhood of women who had thought with a like mind around this idea that we can be the food sheroes that our community needs, to be on the front line, to be those food freedom fighters like a Harriet Tubman, like Georgia Gilmore, like Wangora Maathai, like Fannie Lou Hamer, and the contemporaries, Karen Washington, Jessica Harris, Sharika Kamika, I can go on. And so we lift up their names to know that they might have blazed the trail, but we can continue to be the trailblazers by following in their footsteps, but also making a path for our own. And the reality is there hasn't been that sense of community, within um, within the food, ag, and nutrition health space that's a silo smasher, not being in isolation, only just farmers or chefs or nutritionists, but recognizing that we all should be a part of a larger ecosystem that acknowledges that we really should be having the same end goal of improving the health of our communities. And we represent different parts of the supply chain that does that. And so through education becomes important, not only educating ourselves, but our communities, advocating for the change that goes beyond just the individual, but the collective, and changing the environment through policy and media advocacy, and then the innovation that comes with entrepreneurship and problem solving that's through sustainable models that challenges the existing models that need to have a social enterprise lens to. So for me, the narrative and how we tell the story of women and girls of African descent become important as much as the food. And for me, what I saw happening was so much focus can look at food being the solution that you lose the sense of humanity behind the food. And that's the women and girls. They make up the hunger around the world. They're the first foods of our children. These are just realities that was reinforced by being in gender policy work and just saw the data, from UN, from meeting those who have been the activists like a Gloria Simon and just never thought about gender in the way in which we've been taught about culture. And you can begin, I could see how one person could begin to not realize the value that all of your identities can bring to the table. And you can be the table, and you are enough, and to not shrink and feel that you're not worthy, but you are deserving to have a seat at the table, to make the table, and to invite others to be at that table. And we call that WANDA for us.
And what are some of the key initiatives that WANDA has worked on or is working on right now?
So for us in the beginning, it was our children's book, which was about introducing little Wanda as an aspirational character who is our version of Smokey the Bear, of being able to be that champion of not only food, cultural food as medicine, but also through her story, meeting the women who've been doing the work all along. Whether it's in Nigeria or Kenya or here in the States. And then after that, it's been our WANDA Academy that came about during the pandemic, bringing women to be that sisterhood in terms of learning. There are Black women farmers growing food to heal our communities, to see that we're more than just consumers, we're producers as well. To meet their first Black dietitian if they never have before, along with brief therapists who work through the self-medication that happens, especially when you think about issues of assault and how we can eat ourselves to death by masking the pain and trauma through food that becomes socially accepted. And then we have the need to advocate with the Food Bill of Rights. That's something that we've championed to, one, bring up the realities that we have not supported the ratification of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and how the right to food is a component of that, and tracking and being a part of larger coalitions like the National Right to Food Alliance, where one member state has already passed right to food within their constitution, actually, and how that can be a template for other states to follow. And seeing how food democracy does include us, and not just corporations should have the only voice at the table of shaping food policy. We've not had a place to realize that Black women should be shaping food policy just as much as any other policy. Um, and then the other part is just recently we held the Food is Medicine in the Black Community Gathering, and it was built on what I kept being called to ask and speak on food is medicine. And I'm like, well, whose food is medicine? Um, and realizing our food should be our medicine, and that means our entrepreneurs should be at the table to shape that. And so creating that space for us to come together of Black excellence, of being able to show across the range from foundations to corporations to entrepreneurs to media makers and policymakers that we are in some critical spaces that we could do something better together. But it starts now in building that community. Um, so for me, like these are just some jewels, but the most important jewel I'm proud of within WANDA is starting our endowment and creating a scholarship that is funding women to go to college to study agriculture, nutrition, and dietetics back in my home state where we have anti-discrimination laws in place and navigating that to still make it happen, but also tracing my heritage back to the Fulanis in Nigeria and funding scholarships up to 45 for women there. So at one university, everyone says like, ask Wanda, you want to go to school to get, a degree in nutrition, ask Wanda. And so we have a partnership with not only the university, but local nonprofits to help provide the life skills and mentorship. Um, so we remove the barriers of academic progress, whether it's your eye care or if it's a cell phone issue. But the next is like creating an internship with the local media program so they can start getting the experience beyond just the clinical, but to again show them like there are other pathways of making an impact. In case you don't want to do clinical like me, you can still be in the field and make an impact.
And can you briefly touch on the importance of reclaiming cultural food practices as a form of resistance and empowerment?
Yes, I'm actually giving a keynote at University of Michigan on this coming up. And so I would say that for me, there's so many countless examples. I can give you one where in The Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela's memoir, he speaks of in prison in Robben Island that they were not given white bread. It was only given to the white guards, white prisoners, Indian, like that's it. And so when they wanted something from him, they would offer it. And at some point, he realized, I don't want it. He refused. And so nutritionally, we know that the brown bread is the whole grain bread. It is the one that has the fiber, the vitamin, minerals. When we think about the bran, the germ, the endosperm, all three layers. And so to me, it's the best metaphor of understanding what does the social construct of whiteness comes about and believing that something is better than the rest, but it's not, um, is in the by way of looking at food as a metaphor. And so for me, this idea of resisting is it's about acknowledging that we're resisting these tropes, these stereotypes that affirm one culture over the other of who is more supreme and who's more inferior over the other, which that's not true at all. And it comes up in by way of food. We can give another example. You have fonio, you have millet, you have all these different cereal grasses that are technically not grain, they're gluten free, they're an alternate to a wheat that many people consume refined wheat flour products here in the States. But at the same time, they've been heavily pushed abroad as well, with different trade agreements. And so when we think about, I have friends who have, an allergen, with the gluten in, and so eating their indigenous cereal grasses like a millet, is much better for them. And so we can keep going down the list of all these different examples, of a product, an ingredient, a crop that is, can grow in semi-arid conditions, and in very, um, be very resilient. And in many ways, that's what we should be aiming for as well as humans. Are we being resilient as this very crop called millet, fonio, sorghum, that is not a common staple in our diet, but at one point ancestrally it was. And so eating foods of the ancestors, in alignment with understanding, the memory cells in our DNA. I think there's much to be studied, of understanding nutrition, epigenetics, and how our food infects our cellular environment, and ultimately how does that affect our health. But to be resistant is what we want when it comes to biodiversity, which we don't have enough of in our diet. Um, and right now, we can honestly say, a good chunk of us are eating a mostly westernized diet. And so to resist against, these modern, chronic non-communicable diseases, and resist by way of eating the foods of your ancestors, um, why not? You know, has this other diet been working for you? So to me, it's like take the critical mind, as we would question anything else, and question the why not just as much, and understand the economic implications, right? So as we consume a Western diet, what does that speak on the political, on the economical, as much as the cultural level? What values are we reinforcing? And so I think it's important to be just as critical in understanding the effects of the colonial gaze, and what it does in reinforcing this need to question everything but whiteness, and why that's highly problematic over time, to one's identity, self esteem, confidence, what we pour into our kids to validate their existence. And so, in WANDA, we say our existence is the resistance. And
I
that's
love it.
why health nutrition matters.
I love that. I love that. And I think it speaks to that narrative of like food being oppression as well as food being resistance against that oppression, which I think is something we don't talk about or think about enough in our daily lives, and just how that shows up as something that we do like literally every day. So I appreciate you raising that up and the work that you're doing there. So before I move you on to the Furious Five, the last section of the show, just want to quickly ask, I know you've done a lot of work locally and globally with many different organizations. How do you work to ensure that when you're doing this type of work and these partnerships, that you are amplifying the voices of underrepresented communities?
So, one way in which I think about it, and underrepresented communities, such as the one I live in, come from, you know, and from on an ancestral level, I weave it into my storyline, and I share that. I open up presentations now with honoring my grandmother and acknowledging, and giving space to those who came before us. Even the communities who have been affected by, Boko Haram in the IDP camps, I incorporated it into my TED talk, and about women reclaiming their food as medicine. And so I am mindful and conscious and intentional of how story can be medicine, and how people, who've not been able to be acknowledged. The work of us is to be acknowledging of the hidden figures in the food system. Those are the marginalized voices and communities of women who have been working tirelessly with no acknowledgement, no credit, no coin, no credential. That is the community we represent.
Absolutely. So moving on, Curious 5, the 5 questions that I ask all guests. Number 1, what advice would you give to a student trying to pursue a career in public health?
Well, I would say the first comment I received was like, if you're coming in here to make money, you're in the wrong field. I say if you're going to go into any field, public health included, one, get experience and make your own experiences at the same time.
Number 2, for someone aspiring to lead in public health, what steps would you recommend?
Similar to what I shared about being a master of yourself and not a slave to others, that means be willing to do the work, whether it's healing from childhood trauma, seeing a therapist. You cannot heal a community if you have not worked on your own healing. And also the importance of defining what your values are and how are the environments that you work in speak to your values. And if they're not, you might need a shift.
Number 3, what's something you are working on improving in your life right now?
Organization, hired an organizer. Again, I think knowing that we can't do it all, acknowledge that, create your own advisory board, find people who have the superpowers that you don't possess to make you better and greater. The reality is money is infinite, time is finite. And so how do you maximize your time? By leveraging others who have the time. So I find that to be important. It's one thing to get the experience to do different things, to realize you're not good at it and outsource it.
That's great advice. Number 4, professionally, do you recommend anything?
Yeah, read the book Who Cooked the Last Supper? Women's History of the World by Rosalind Miles. It's a fantastic read. I intentionally made that my reading list for 2024 because it became clear that while we focus so much on racism in this country, that we tend to lose sight of sexism and gender inequities and how they were the original sins baked into our societal fabrics. And once you understand that, then it's easy to understand racism.
Well, I'll be adding that to my list. And last but not least, if there was one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self, what would that be?
I would say that you can be all the things who you are, but at the same time, you have to take time to understand how do you bring your different talents together and make the masterpiece of your life. So be kind, give yourself grace, and be willing to bend but not break.
Tambra, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights, your story. I learned a lot, and I know a lot of other people are also going to be inspired by your work and your journey. And thank you for the work that you continue to do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Truly, truly is my pleasure. Housekeeping items, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you have not as yet. Leave a 5-star review. Share this episode with a friend. Connect with Tambra on LinkedIn, links below, and you can learn more about WANDA at iamwanda.org. I will see you all next week. Have a good rest of your week. Peace, everyone.